A woman stood close enough to a man to touch him. She spoke to him. He answered her, out loud, in a voice she had heard almost every day for years. She looked directly at his face, and she concluded that he was the person who tended the grounds. That woman was Mary Magdalene. The man was Jesus of Nazareth, 3 days after his execution. And this is the first thing that happens on the first morning of the Christian movement. It is still dark when she reaches the garden. The stone path is cold through the soles of her sandals, and the air holds that particular chill Jerusalem keeps at 750 meters before the sun clears the Mount of Olives. Somewhere below her, in the crowded lower city, ovens are being lit. There is dust in the air, the fine, pale limestone dust that never entirely settles in this country, and under it the green smell of a garden in the barley harvest. Olive leaves, turned earth. She has come to finish a job left unfinished on Friday because the light ran out and the Sabbath came in. And this is not a story about one woman with tired eyes at dawn. Over the following weeks it happens again and again in different places, in different light, to different people. 2 travelers will walk beside him on an open road for the better part of 3 hours, in continuous conversation, in daylight, and not know who he is. A room full of men who ate with him for 3 years will look at him standing in front of them and conclude they are seeing a spirit. 7 men in a boat will hear him call across 90 meters of water at daybreak, and 6 of them will not know the voice. Every one of the 4 Gospels records this. None of them explains it, and they had every reason to leave it out. It is not a flattering detail. It makes the first witnesses of the movement's central claim look unreliable, and their opponents noticed the oldest surviving pagan attack on these accounts, which we will come to, goes for this exact weak point. And yet the writers kept it in different forms, from different sources, without ever smoothing the versions into agreement. So let us ask the question the way it deserves to be asked, and answer it properly. Why did the people who knew him best not recognize Jesus after he rose? There are 5 serious answers. 4 of them are partly right. One of them is the one the texts themselves keep pointing at, and it is not the one most people expect. First, the ground under her feet. The year is most commonly reckoned as AD 33, and that reckoning deserves one word of honesty up front, because it is not settled. Historians argue for an interval somewhere between the years 30 and 33, and the leading candidates each satisfy the Passover chronology under a different reconstruction of the lunar calendar. This video uses the year 33 as an anchor because it is the conventional one, not because it is proven. What is certain is the week. Passover has just passed, and the 7 days of unleavened bread are running, which means the city is at its most crowded moment of the year. A resident population that scholars working from water supply and built area, Joachim Jeremias, and later Megan Broschi among them, put plausibly somewhere between 20 and 40,000, swelling several times over for the feast. Ranges, not certainties. Roman soldiers on the walls, a nervous priesthood, and a garden outside the city at first light. Now watch what happens in it. Mary finds the tomb open. She runs, she reports. Peter and another disciple run back with her. They look, they leave. She stays, weeping, and turns, and there is a man standing there. He asks her why she is weeping and who she is looking for. And John records her conclusion in a single clause. She supposed him to be the gardener. That is not an absurd inference. It is the most reasonable inference available to her. John has already told us the tomb stood in a garden. It is barely light. A working man at that hour, in that place, would be wearing what every laborer wore: an under tunic, an outer garment, sandals, something over the head against the sun and the dust. Nothing in that silhouette separates a teacher from a groundskeeper at 20 paces in half light. So here is the first candidate answer, and it is the obvious one. The conditions were bad. It was nearly dark. Grief had emptied her. She was not expecting him, and the human eye doesn't so much report what stands in front of it as assemble what the mind is prepared to see. Hold on to that, because it is real, and because it is about to fall apart. What breaks it is what happens next. He says one word, her name.
Peace.
And she knows him instantly. Nothing changed about the light. Nothing changed about the distance. He did not step forward or push back a hood. He said Mary, and the recognition came through her ears rather than her eyes. That is the first crack in the physical explanation, and the pattern it opens holds for everything that follows. When recognition finally comes, in this entire account, it almost never comes through a face. Which brings us to the road. It is later the same day. Two people are walking west out of Jerusalem toward a village called Emmaus. One is named Cleopas. The other Luke never names, which is strange, because Luke names people, including women, more readily than any other evangelist. The guesses offered across the centuries are only guesses, and the text is silent. Where Emmaus stood, nobody can tell you with confidence. The manuscripts themselves disagree about the distance, some reading 60 stadia and some 160. What matters for our question is the shorter reading, because 11 kilometers over that broken descent out of the Judean hills is a walk of roughly 2.5 to 3 hours. 3 hours, in daylight, side by side, in continuous conversation. That is how long they were with him. Not a glimpse in the dark, not a figure across a field. Hours, in step, close enough to talk without raising their voices, on a road where travelers moved in company for safety and filled the distance with exactly this kind of talk. And Luke describes their condition in one sentence with a very deliberate piece of grammar. Their eyes, he writes, were kept from recognizing him. It is a passive construction. Something is being done to their perception. Luke does not tell us who is doing it, and I am not going to supply an agent the text withholds. So they walk, and he asks what they are discussing, and they stop, and Luke says their faces were downcast. And then Cleopas says the most human sentence in the resurrection narratives. We had hoped. Not we hope. We had hoped. The tense of a thing already abandoned. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. And then a list of facts, assembled by two people who have already reached their conclusion. He was a prophet mighty in deed and word. The chief priests delivered him up. He was crucified. It is now the third day. Some women of our company astonished us. They saw a vision of angels. Some of us went and found it as the women said. But him they did not see. They have the evidence. They have the empty tomb second-hand but confirmed. They have the women's testimony. They have 3 years of teaching. And they are walking away from the city in the wrong direction, reciting the facts of a story they have decided is over. Let me stop the road right there, because I want to ask you something. What have you already decided is over? Not as an abstraction, something specific, something you hoped for and stopped hoping for, and have since built your reasoning around, the way these two built theirs. Carefully, honestly, with every fact in hand, and with the wrong conclusion. If that is sitting with you as you listen, tell me in the comments. I read them, and this passage seems to find people in exactly that place. Now, what happens at the end of that road destroys the easy explanation for good. They reach the village toward evening and press him to stay, because in that world, pressing a stranger to stay was not courtesy, but obligation. Inns were few, disreputable and dangerous, and village hospitality carried real weight. He goes in. Picture the room, because the physical setting is the whole argument here. An ordinary village house. Reclining at table was for festivals. On a normal evening, people sat at a low table. The light is a small, closed oil lamp, wheel-made, the standard domestic type of the period, thousands of which have come out of the ground across Judea. It throws a close, steady light across a table, perhaps a meter wide. It is the week of unleavened bread, so the bread is flat, and bread in this world is never cut. It is torn by hand. And he takes the bread, and blesses it, and breaks it, and gives it to them. 4 verbs: took, blessed, broke, gave. Luke has written that exact sequence twice before in his gospel. Once on a hillside with 5,000 people, and once in an upper room 3 nights earlier. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him. The same passive as before, reversed. Luke has bracketed the entire episode between 2 things done to their sight. But look hard at the physical circumstances at the instant of recognition. This is the closest they have been to him all day. It is the best light they have had all day. Steady lamplight at arm's length. He is seated directly across a small table, facing them. If bad conditions were the answer, recognition should have arrived hours earlier, on an open road under an afternoon sun. It did not. It arrived indoors, after dark, over a gesture made with a pair of hands. That is the end of the first candidate. Poor light, exhaustion, and distance are real contributors. They are not the cause. So test the second, that he had changed, that the risen body simply looked different. There is textual support, and it needs to be given accurately rather than conveniently. Mark's gospel says he appeared to 2 of them in another form as they walked into the country. And that verse sits inside the longer ending of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, which is absent from Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, the 2 oldest complete manuscripts of the New Testament in existence. That is not a footnote, and no honest treatment can lean on the verse without saying it. Paul, writing earlier and on far firmer ground, does contrast the body that is sown with the body that is raised. Isaiah, centuries before, described a servant whose appearance was marred beyond human semblance. So transformation of some kind is defensible, and by itself it fails, on the shore of a lake. Some weeks later, 7 of them have gone back to Galilee and back to fishing. They work through the night, which is standard practice on that water, because the fish rise in the cool hours, and a cast net works best in the dark. We know the scale of the boat with real precision, because in 1986, a drought dropped the water level near Kibbutz Ginosar, and 2 brothers, Moshe and Yuval Lufan, found a hull in the mud. It was excavated under Shelley Waxman for the Israel Antiquities Authority. It measures roughly 8 meters by 2 1/3, and radiocarbon dating places it in a window spanning the 1st century before Christ and the 1st century after. That is the vessel, a handful of men in a small open boat at the end of a long, empty night. At daybreak, a man is standing on the shore. John gives the distance, about 200 cubits, roughly 90 meters. He calls out. They answer. He tells them to put the net out on the other side. They do, and the net fills. And then one of them, the disciple John's gospel calls the one Jesus loved, says to Peter, "It is the Lord." Stop there. That is the most important sentence in this entire investigation. Because in that boat, at that moment, every man has identical conditions. The same daybreak light, the same 90 meters of water, the same voice crossing it, the same net, the same night, the same exhaustion. One of them recognizes him, the others do not. If the explanation were a changed appearance, that could not happen. A transformed face is transformed for everybody in the boat. Whatever separates these men is not in their eyes. It is somewhere behind their eyes. And John adds one more detail once they are ashore, and a charcoal fire is burning. And the word he uses for that fire is rare. And the only other place he uses it is the fire in the high priest's courtyard, where Peter warmed his hands and swore he did not know the man. John says none of them dared ask who he was because they knew it was the Lord. They knew, and they still felt they should not ask. Something about him survived the recognition and stayed strange. So, not the light, and not simply the face. Which brings us to the third candidate, the emotional one. And here the gospel writers show a psychological precision that is genuinely unusual in ancient narrative. Fear is present. The doors of the room were locked for fear of the authorities, and this is a group whose leader was executed by the state 4 days earlier. That fear is not neurosis. It is arithmetic. Grief is present, obviously. But Luke names 2 stranger obstacles. When the women return from the tomb with their report, the men dismiss it as leros, a word that appears in Greek medical writing for the raving of someone in a fever. Not a lie. Delirium. The report was filed under symptoms rather than evidence. And later, in that room, while he is standing in front of them showing them his hands and his feet, Luke writes that they still disbelieved for joy. For joy. Not despite it, because of it. And if you have ever received news so good that your first instinct was to refuse it until somebody confirmed it twice, you already know exactly what Luke is describing. The mind's refusal is not always a refusal of the evidence. Sometimes it is a defense against the size of what is being offered. But every one of these states explains reluctance to accept. None of them explains failure to perceive. Cleopas was not too frightened to see a face. He was in an ordinary conversation on an ordinary road and did not know who was talking to him. Which leaves 2 answers. And here is the thing. The second of them is stated out loud, in the Gospels, by a woman who says it before any of this happens. She tells us, in one sentence, exactly why nobody could have been expecting what they were looking at. The fourth candidate is the plain reading of Luke's grammar, that their perception was held and then released. The text asserts the constraint twice in one episode and withholds the agent both times, and the responsible thing is to report it at exactly that level of reticence. The fifth is the one the whole New Testament is quietly pointing at. They had no category for what they were seeing. Understand what resurrection meant in that world. It was not an unfamiliar idea to a first-century Jew. It was a familiar idea with a fixed shape. Daniel had written of many who sleep in the dust of the earth, awaking. The 7 brothers of the Maccabean literature go to their deaths, expecting to be raised by the God who gave them breath. It was a real and widely held hope, not universal, since the Sadducees denied it outright, as both Mark and Acts record, but mainstream. And everyone who held that hope held it in the same form. Resurrection was corporate. It happened to everybody. And it happened at the end, on the last day, when God closed history and vindicated his people. You do not have to reconstruct this from inference. You can hear a disciple say it in her own words before any of it happened. When Jesus tells Martha at Bethany that her brother will rise again, Martha answers with complete theological correctness. I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. That is the category. That was the only shape the concept had. One man, alone, in the middle of history, on an ordinary Sunday, while the world carried on and the barley came in. Nobody was expecting that. Nobody had a slot for it. And you can watch the 12 themselves fail to find one. Mark tells us that when Jesus spoke to them of rising from the dead, they kept it among themselves and argued over what rising from the dead could even mean. These are men who have heard him say it repeatedly, standing in a huddle trying to work out what the words refer to, which is where this stops being a story about one strange weekend and becomes the last chapter of something much longer. Because the failure to recognize him on Sunday is not new. It is the continuation of a pattern that runs through the entire ministry. And Luke marks it with the same grammar he uses on the Emmaus road. 18 chapters earlier, Luke writes that they did not understand a saying of his, and that it was concealed from them. Passive again. Same construction, same withheld agent. Later, before the final journey to Jerusalem, Luke stacks 3 clauses in a row. They understood none of these things. The saying was hidden from them. They did not grasp what was said. Mark says they did not understand and were afraid to ask. And once, in the middle of a lake at night, they saw him coming toward them on the water and cried out, because they thought he was a phantom, which is, structurally, word for word, what happens in the locked room after the resurrection, when they see him and suppose they are seeing a spirit. The men who failed to recognize the risen Jesus were the same men who had spent 3 years failing to understand the living one. Sunday morning did not create the problem. Sunday morning was the last and hardest instance of it. Now, before we get to what he himself says about all this, the objection deserves a hearing because it is old, it is serious, and it targets precisely this material. Around the year 178, a pagan philosopher named Celsus wrote a full-scale attack on Christianity. It survives because Origen quoted it at length in order to answer it, and Celsus goes straight for the appearances. His case is that the whole thing rests on a hysterical woman and a handful of partisans, that a real God, having risen, would have shown himself to his enemies, to the judge who condemned him, to the crowd in the street, that the witnesses were self-selected and their testimony therefore worthless. That is a real argument, and it is nearly 19 centuries old. The record outside the New Testament gives us less than people often claim, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Tacitus confirms that Christus was executed under Pilate in the reign of Tiberius, and that the movement, checked for the moment, broke out again, first in Judea, then at Rome. He records the resurgence and offers no opinion on its cause. As for Josephus, the passage in his Antiquities mentioning an appearance on the 3rd day contains material that virtually all scholars regard as a later Christian insertion into a shorter original notice. It cannot be used as independent testimony. But there is one piece of internal evidence that bears directly on what Celsus alleges, and it is easy to miss. The earliest datable summary of the resurrection claim is not in a gospel. It is a short creed Paul says he received and passed on, listing appearance after appearance, to Cephas, to the 12, to more than 500 at once, to James, to all the apostles, and last of all to Paul himself. That creed says nothing whatsoever about anybody failing to recognize him, which means the non-recognition was never part of the preaching. It is not a proclamation point. It is not an apologetic asset. It is a liability, and it survives only in the narrative sources, preserved by writers who had no motive to preserve it, every reason to trim it, and who kept it anyway. People do not invent the details that make their own witnesses look foolish. So what was actually wrong with these men and women? He tells them. That is the part almost always left out. And it is the answer this whole video has been walking toward. On the road to Emmaus, before the village, before the meal, before the bread, he answers them. And what he says is not look closer. It is not your grief is clouding you. He says, how foolish and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And then he takes them through Moses and all the prophets and interprets the things concerning himself. The diagnosis comes from his own mouth, and it is neither optical nor psychological. It is interpretive. They were reading the story wrong. And John, standing at the empty tomb, delivers the same verdict flatly, in his own voice as narrator. As yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. That is why the empty tomb convinced nobody on its own. An empty tomb is not an argument. It is an absence, and an absence gets filled by whatever framework you bring to it. Mary brought a framework and concluded the body had been moved, which was the sensible reading of the evidence she had. The two on the road brought a framework and concluded the movement had failed. They had the right texts, the right teacher, 3 years of instruction, and a settled reading with no room in it for the man walking beside them. They did not miss him because their eyes were weak. They missed him because they already knew how the story ended, and they were wrong. And there is one thing about him that people did recognize every single time, without hesitation: the wounds. In the locked room, John says, he showed them his hands and his side, and then they rejoiced, not before. Then, the same evidence is offered to Thomas a week later, individually, on his own terms. Luke's version says the same: see my hands and my feet. The risen body was identified by what had been done to the crucified one. And Zechariah, 5 centuries earlier, had written of a day when they would look on him whom they had pierced, a text John himself quotes at the foot of the cross. That is the resolution of the paradox. The glory did not make him recognizable. The scars did. And underneath all of it lies an older pattern the Hebrew Scriptures had already set down. A brother is handed over by his own family and vanishes into death as far as they know. Years later, he is exalted in a foreign court, and they come and stand in front of him, and Genesis puts it in a single line. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And what ends their blindness is not scrutiny. They never work it out by staring. He discloses himself by speaking, which is precisely what happens in a garden outside Jerusalem, when a woman looks directly at a man she does not know, and he says her name. Isaiah had said it too in the passage about the servant. No form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him, not esteemed by those who saw him. On that reading, the unrecognizability of the risen Jesus is not a reversal of the servant's career. It is the last stretch of it. He was unrecognized before the cross on exactly the same terms. And there is a final scene, years later on a different road, involving a man who never walked with him at all. Saul of Tarsus is traveling to Damascus with warrants in his hand when a light stops him, and a voice says his name, twice, where Mary's was said once. And Saul answers with a question. Who are you, Lord? He did not know either. The most rigorously trained interpreter of the scriptures in the entire narrative, a man schooled in precisely the texts Jesus had opened on the Emmaus road. And his first words to the risen Christ are a request for identification. And then, and only then, he is told. So here is where this lands. The most human line in the whole account isn't spoken by an angel or a soldier or a priest. It is two exhausted people on a road saying, "We had hoped." Not doubt, disappointment, the particular grief of having believed something, watched it not happen, and then done the sensible thing, which is to revise your conclusions and go home. And what strikes me every time is how the story treats them. He does not correct their theology first. He does not lead with the answer. He falls into step, asks what they are talking about, and lets them narrate their own loss badly and at length, for what may have been an hour before he says anything substantial at all. Then he opens the scriptures. Then they walk the rest of the way. Then a meal. And then, last of all, at a table, over a gesture made with two hands, they see. The walking came before the seeing. That is not incidental to the story. That is the story. They were not looking for a stranger. They were looking for a corpse, or for nothing at all. And the thing they had stopped expecting was keeping pace with them on the road, asking them questions, waiting. Which brings me back to what I asked you earlier, and I would rather leave it with you than answer it. What have you already decided is over? And would you recognize it if it were walking beside you? If this is the kind of first-century reconstruction you want more of. Sources named, disputes left open, evidence weighed rather than dressed up. Then stay with us. That is what we do here, one question at a time. And tell me below, of everyone in this account, Mary in the garden, Cleopas on the road, the men in the boat, Thomas in the room, Saul on the highway, which one do you understand best? Not which one was right. Which one you understand. I will be reading.